Welcome to CETV, Community Education Television. I'm your host, Doug Greer, Dean for Community Education at Waubonsee Community College. Let's take a look at today's show. It's CETV, and today we're talking about self-publishing with 4 local self-published authors. Each of our guests participated in the Journey to Self-Publishing panel presentation that Community Education held on March 2nd, and we've invited each of them here today to talk more about self-publishing. Nancy Wall, on my left, is author of Pulled by the Heart, a book which recounts her real-life story of living and escaping the Middle East. Dawn Stazak is a senior administrative assistant in a Fortune 500 company and author of A Guru in the Office, 50 Ways to Remember Your Spirit in the Corporate World. Barbara Ann Brester is a teacher poet and author of Selling the Farm and The Journey East, 2 books of poetry. And Dr. Jorge Pertida is a psychologist and author of The Promise of the Fifth Son, Ancestral Journeys of Self-Discovery. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for being with us here today to talk about self-publishing. I'm curious when you each first decided that you were actually going to publish something.
Well, for me, I decided to self-publish when I tried the traditional publishers, and it just didn't work out. They didn't say anything negative about the work. It's just for one reason or another, they couldn't get me on their list, or I didn't receive a reply. And I said, well, you know, I guess I'm going to self-publish someday, and I decided to do it.
How long did you try and to go the traditional route?
Well, I was pretty methodical. I did it for a year, and I sent it out to 10 different places a month.
Wow, okay.
So I sent to over 100 publishers and agents, and just kept notes of what the replies were, and I took any constructive criticism and just made notes of it. Luckily, there wasn't really any, so that was good.
Right. Okay. How about you guys? When did you first decide that you were going to self-publish your own book?
My decision came about in its own manner, and I just went with it, as I do many things when I kind of feel that way. But I first got those books, how to publish, agents, all the things that you're supposed to do. So I went and got those books, and I thought, okay, I've got to read this. Well, I got into it a little bit, and I read it, and I thought, you know, this is not going to work for me. I just can't imagine sending out my manuscript to hundreds of people and being turned down hundreds of times. So I thought, you know, that's just probably not going to work. So I put it aside. And I think that in the world that we live today, with all the networking that most people do, with the internet, in the business world, everything you do, you start talking to people and you will connect the dots pretty quickly. And I did. A lot of people knew I was in the process of writing this book, and somebody said, you know, I know somebody. And I said, really? Don't know if he can help you, but here's his name and number. So I started there, and I quickly found out that publishers specialize in certain areas. So I'm certainly not going to send a manuscript of an autobiography to a company that deals with poetry and so on and so forth, so you really need to distinguish that. The gentleman read my manuscript and fell in love with it, but said, I'm sorry, I don't do this type of thing, but I will try to find the right person. So it started from there. I wrote a letter, and I thought, oh, this is good, and I'm going to send it out to these publishers on the East and West Coast. And then I looked at it and I thought, now why would I do that to myself? Why would I do that to myself? So I decided not to go that route, and started networking with people, and eventually, it's kind of a long story, I found the right way to do it.
Okay. Jorge, when did you first decide that you were going to publish?
You know, Doug, for me, it was really more about writing and once the product was done, it needed to be birthed really quickly. So self-publishing for me was really the way to get it out. I also, you know, had been focusing very much more on the writing process. And once that was done, I really didn't want to go through the whole process of finding a publisher. So I was actually talking to a colleague of mine, and she said, you really need to, I tend to do a lot of public speaking, and she said, you know, especially if you're already doing that, it'd be a lot easier to just sort of get self-published, get your books out there, and then just start, you know, distributing yourself. And that's exactly what happened. I started to look at, you know, self-publishers and realize that, you know, you could very quickly get something done. And so for me, that was really more an issue of trying to get the writing out.
Did you try at all with the traditional publishing route?
Not
or
at all.
Bypass that completely?
Bypass that completely and didn't even try at all. I really felt that, you know, if for me it was really important that my book take some root and that find a couple of loyal readers, and I think that I do believe very much in an organic movement, and if it takes off, you know, great, but I really do believe in creating a base of readers that would support the work. I think self-publishing really allows you to have, as Barbara was mentioning, that connection with people. You know, you're able to distribute your book, and you're able to really sort of hand it off to somebody so that you know it's being nurtured in a way that you really want it. I think that, you know, for me, the idea of you know, mainstream publisher, the research that I did would really tell me that, you know, you'd lose a lot of that control because you don't really have a whole lot of idea of how that's distributed. And if somebody receives it, for example, in a brick-and-mortar bookstore, in a regular bookstore, you don't know what's going to happen to that book. If it doesn't sell, then it's on you to be able to get it back and, you know, pay the fees that are affiliated with that. So I think that for somebody who's just starting out, the idea of nurturing your book and making sure it gets into the right readers is, for me, was very important.
Barbara, how about you? When did you
It's
first
entirely
decide?
different for a poet, because the rule of thumb is if you think you have a body of work that's a book, a third of it should have been published in literary journals or things of that nature. So both those books stood that test, and I was actually accepted by a publisher, and we had philosophical differences and parted ways. He was a university professor and ran a very successful literary magazine, which is hard to do because lots of them fold quickly for financial reasons. And he trotted me around for about a year like a little show horse, reading at libraries and bookstores and saying, this is going to be our first book. This poetry is going to be our first book. But I attended a board meeting, and his advisors were telling him, you're going off in all directions, you're overextending yourself, we advise against, you know, going so fast and so far. So he had kept my manuscript a year, and I called him and said, I want it back. I want some action here. He was sort of into the romance of we're writers, we're publishers. You know, I wanted to see it in print. So I took the risk of taking it back and sort of then saying, I want to do it my way, which I was happy with then.
Thank you. We'll have to take a short break, and we'll be back to continue our discussion about self-publishing.